Cool, so we'll just go through the early intervention stuff. And I promised Cliff I would. Okay, so early intervention, and I can remember this even myself when I was a young teenager, this thought that, because I went off the rails as a teenager, right off the rails. And I know that a lot of us have had experiences that are pretty negative as a teenager, and this feeling inside of, if only someone had caught me earlier before this had happened, or if only we stopped, we were in the families earlier, if only, that if only feeling is an early intervention feeling, is if we were engaged earlier, then things might be able to be better for those young people. And you'll find that no matter what you do in youth development, it will always rise as a key argument. It's also used in education as a key argument as well. Early intervention will stop future problems like failure at school, obesity, youth crime, drugs and alcohol, youth suicide. If we get them all early, then we're going to stop it. That's the key argument that's there. And it's reasoned mainly through what's called longitudinal research, and those of you that did the research paper last year will remember longitudinal research is research that's done over a long period of time compared to cross-sectional, which is just cutting a cross-section of a period of time. So one picture compared to one giant picture. And in the longitudinal research, they can show patterns of when one young person with all these conditions in their life suddenly goes off the rails later on. In the ETV channel, there's actually a documentary series called the Why Am I series. It was on TV last year, and we did watch a bit of it in the research class as well, because it's a very sound longitudinal study, even though I say that and I feel my heart tearing inside. But I have to be honest, as a researcher, it is seen in the world as one of the most leading studies ever done. And that even looks at things like schizophrenia and how schizophrenia is brought on by various factors, and early intervention can stop it. So getting in early can stop these things. So the Why Am I series looks into crime, looks into schizophrenia, and it actually wants to look at all the factors that are in a person's life. And it will call them risk factors and protective factors. So what risk factors lead to schizophrenia? Well, we know that some of it is what's actually genetically in the brain. We also know, though, that actually there are two peak times of schizophrenia, and this is from the study. One is peak times to identify it. One is in childhood, if children actually think they're actually hearing voices, not just an imaginary friend, but if they actually hear or feel like they're audibly hearing voices that are not there, then that could be a risk factor that could show that there could be a tendency for them to develop schizophrenia later on. Some of the worst risk factors, though, come in adolescence, and particularly marijuana. Marijuana is the biggest risk factor for schizophrenia. So if your brain's wired, ready for the schizophrenia switch to be released, and you even have a single joint, that could put you into a psychotic episode which you cannot get out of. And so, when I'm working with young people, and I know, and we also know little things from studies like this, and Dunedin study, I'm picking on schizophrenia because it's a really good documented one in the Dunedin study, that if your parents have got schizophrenia, then that raises the risk. If you are a twin, then that of parents of schizophrenia, then that raises the risk. They can't say that it's genetically given to you generation to generation because it needs that environmental switch. And when that environmental switch happens, it's released. And it's incredibly damaging. And the Why Am I series actually has a young guy who's now in his 20s who talks about the single joint that he had, and the next minute he's woken up in a mental health institution with a full-blown psychotic episode and diagnosis of schizophrenia. So this is where this stuff comes from, and I shouldn't say I'm highly opposed to early intervention. When I see stuff like that with schizophrenia, I find that really, really helpful. Some of the families we work with schizophrenia is a reality for the kids that we're engaging with. So It's actually empowering for me to know this research and know what the risk factors are, and actually to say to a kid, just don't use a joint, wait till you're 25, wait till your brain's fully developed, don't use a joint now. If you're going to do anything silly, get drunk. Because the chances of schizophrenia and alcohol is less. Yeah, so having that knowledge can actually really, really help. But people like myself actually critique it, not so much for those health outcomes, but for the crime and education outcomes. And I'll give you the typical example that I would give our students when I was teaching up at Vic. And this comes, from my research as well. So in this bucket, this rubbish bin, if you pretend it's full of sand, okay? Each piece of that sand is young people with risk factors in their lives that puts them at risk of criminal outcomes and being involved with the justice system and ultimately prison. The reality is, only that much of the rubbish bin will go on to that future. So if we target early intervention on the entire rubbish bin, we risk what sociologists would say, labelling and stigmatisation. And that's where the sociologists come in and say that's where the problem is, because if you stigmatise, you can put in place a self-fulfilling prophecy. So the kid feels picked on and therefore is going to go through and have that future. And this argument came out last year because, again, out of another longitudinal research, I think it had a relationship to the Dunedin study. There's another one in New Zealand too called the Christchurch study. But out of some research last year, a psychologist had claimed that they had developed the ultimate screening tool for child abuse in New Zealand. That if you put every variable in for adults in New Zealand, you could determine who would be the abusers. And so which children would be born into an abusive environment before they were actually born. And the instrument apparently has been tested overseas and has been seen to be very, very reliable. And last year the government were looking at putting it into SIFS completely, or our new ministry now, as the tool to identify families that need early intervention. But the risk then happens is we know that all Māori families in poverty will be in that category. We know, you can just see that some of these communities are going to be just lumped into that category. And whilst if the intervention is good and positive, then that's okay. Us as researchers are okay. But actually we know that fiscally, financially in New Zealand, we don't have enough money to actually do this sort of thing. And so, like our restorative justice family group conferences, something will go missing and stigmatisation will enter in. And when you look at, if you do decide to look at the Whānau Ora video, it is really interesting to watch because it feels like there's all this great intention going in, but in each Whānau Ora initiative is completely different because they're developed by centres and working with the families and communities. But the initiative that they show, you sort of feel like there's a bit of labelling and stigmatisation happening, but this is now within a Māori community, not within a Pākehā on Māori. So that stigmatisation stuff is seen as really, really problematic. And then the other side of it too is when the kids that get that should be getting the early intervention don't, again because of stigmatisation. So that could be our poor Pākehā. And I could say, growing up in the state housing block, that even though, and my family was known to the social welfare, but I can say that it appeared that the social workers always went round to the brown families, and we were constantly with the brown families, but saw the white families as having some ability to look after themselves. So that counter stuff, and so what could happen in the white person's house is not told to the rest of the world. So that's basically what it is, and the criticism around it. But I'm not trying to say it's completely bad. I'm trying to say there's that cautionary thing that we really need to be aware of where the problems are. And Rob White goes into that as well, of the labelling and stigmatisation. So going from that, I'm going to show you an initiative that I actually think is really, really good. And for those of you who have done designing, you'll know of community assets mapping. So this fits in a lines of community assets mapping quite well. And it's called Communities that Care. It started in the UK, and it started primarily as a substance abuse prevention tool. So stopping drugs and alcohol grown in a community, not grown, it makes it sound like people grow marijuana plants. It was trying to stop, the proliferation of drugs and alcohols in communities, and it came with the conclusion. The people that designed it, Centre for Substance Abuse Prevention, came to the conclusion that the answers to stuff like substance abuse aren't in the professionals' hands only, but are actually in the communities. And this is part of what I like about this as well. It's got a positive spin to it the whole way around, so I can see it actually can be used sociologically. And the videos that you have on Moodle for it, you'll see that it's been used by churches around the world too to build into communities around them, to actually use their assets to help communities. There's something about it that actually goes, hey, this is actually quite an empowering tool. So yeah, they were keen to actually empower communities to address issues around substance abuse. And with young people, it's been used for substance abuse, crime, and healthy behaviours. Okay, and it has 5 stages, and throughout this whole cycle, reflections built. So the first stage is getting started, and in the getting started stage, that's like, for those of you that have done any form of research, or even, again, the designing, that's the scoping stage. Understanding, getting a whole lot of information about the community that you're in and working with, knowing who the key contacts are in that community, starting to make contacts as well, and those key contacts could be young people. The next stage is like getting organised. Have I got these? Oh yeah, look at that. That's better. The next stage is that you bring your group together, and the group itself forms the vision. You might be going into a community as a suicide prevention person, but you've got a good understanding of sociology now. So you're going to actually go, well, rather than just looking at suicide, what is the vision of this group for this community? I'll pick on Wainuiomata. What is the vision of this group for Wainuiomata? Because ultimately, it won't be about suicide prevention. Ultimately, it will be about young people feeling like they are loved and included. Yep. So having that vision enables everything else to flow on, rather than saying, our vision is to have 50% less young people using alcohol by the end of the year. It doesn't have that same sort of impact, yeah. So having that vision, and then doing both needs and assets mapping, with a focus on understanding where the risk factors are. So whilst you're doing the both, you actually know if the issue that you're going in, I'll pick on suicide again, is youth suicide, you will know that some of the risk factors for youth suicide are poverty at that big level, but you'll also know that there's social issues around like depression, bullying, all those other things, and it's multifaceted. You would know that actually these risk factors branch everywhere. So you've got this idea of risk factors, and what do you need to actually address these factors and reduce them, and what assets do you have in the community that you can draw upon to actually address these factors. And then you create a plan and an action plan, so you a prevention program and an action plan. Then you implement it and you evaluate it as you're implementing it, and you're continuously going round and around and around. Okay? And so what I would say here is, if you're using community care as a youth worker, your head starts to switch from being a youth worker to a social worker. It's slightly different. It's not like you just working alongside and bringing people into a space, but working alongside one individual youth and bringing that youth and taking that youth on a journey. It's about you working alongside a community, empowering that community, and working with the key stakeholders in that community, which is how a social worker would work. Yeah, so I've already said that. And that is Communities that Care.